Welcome to A Course in Graceful Presence, Practice 5, Aspire to the Greatness of Goodness. Last time we talked about Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, who gave us the fundamental rule of life with those twin aspects of objectivity of perception and attunement of inner attitude. And I love Epictetus. I love to read his teachings in both the Enchiridion that we looked at last time, but also in his discourses. Just some fabulous stuff. And if you have a chance, I would really encourage you to buy, a copy of Epictetus's discourses and Enchiridion, along with Marcus Aurelius's meditations. Just wonderful readings. But today, though, we'll be talking about Socrates, my favorite philosopher of all time. I love Socrates, and we'll get to him in just a moment. But I wanted to actually go back for a moment and talk about Epictetus. He had a student. A student came to him and he said, "Hey, teacher, how can I get my brother to stop being mad and angry with me?" And Epictetus replied something like, "It is none of your business. It is none of your concern if your brother is mad and angry at you or anyone else. Your sole business, your only concern is yourself," he told the student, "and you can choose not to be mad or angry at your brother, period." Right? Seems harsh, but again, it's that idea that we cannot control other people's feelings, opinions, attitudes, thoughts, only our own, and we have to accept them however they present themselves to us. Now, for me, the difficulty is not remaining, confident and calm and resilient on my own by myself. But what's always been challenging for me is how do I maintain my, graceful presence when I'm with someone or around someone who is always or often, filled with guarded self-consciousness, who are feeling, doubt and inadequacies and insecurities which make them strike out in angry and mad ways. That's always been the challenge for me, and we'll certainly be talking more about that with some of our other strategies of graceful presence. But you should always care for and respect others. I mean, each person possesses intrinsic value and deserves respect as a human being, but their opinions are too often the result of fear and insecurity. Other people's opinions, and often our own, too often arise from our own fear and insecurities. So we should care for and love others, but not be, held hostage by their opinions, their feelings, or their own presence. We'll be talking more about that. I also wanted to kind of begin with a quote from one of my favorite American philosophers, Henry David Thoreau. Here's a picture of Walden Pond. When I was in graduate school at Boston College, my family and I, we would often go to Walden Pond. Today, on one end, there is a public beach where you can sunbathe and swim. And on the opposite side of the pond is the cabin site where Thoreau built a cabin and for 2 years tried to live a self-sufficient life and wrote his wonderful book, Walden, all about that experience. And in that book, he says, and I quote, "To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, nor even to found a school, but so to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It is to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically." And that's always been my approach, right? Philosophy and the study of ethics in this ethics and values class should help us live better lives. I mean, the study of philosophy is not just a academic subject, but it is a way of life, of living with graceful presence. So let's maybe look at a couple of questions. What is philosophy and who is a philosopher? Let's start off with that first question, right? Philosophy is the love of wisdom. I mean, the very word itself is composed of two Greek words. You have philia, which means love, specifically the love of friendship, and sophia, which means wisdom. So in its very name, philosophy is the love of wisdom. I've always wanted to make a bumper sticker that said, philosophers make the best lovers, but my wife only laughs when I say that. In any case, let's think about that for a moment. To love wisdom, because that's who philosophers, or what philosophers do. They love wisdom. Love in this sense means to care for wisdom, to serve wisdom, right? So what is wisdom? Well, if you read the Apology, the reading for today, you know that Socrates thinks that wisdom is, for humans anyways, knowing that you don't know. So loving wisdom, in a sense, is care and concern for the fact that you don't really know what you think you know. You have the humility, I guess, to express your ignorance. Now, here's an interesting thought. How do you know that you don't know something, right? That's challenging. How do you know that you don't know? Because if you knew you didn't know it, does that mean you know it? So how do you know that you don't know something? Well, the answer is you have a question. You know that you don't know something because you have a question about it. That question reveals your ignorance. So in a very real sense, philosophers love wisdom by asking questions, right? Philosophers care for, serve wisdom by asking questions. And you all were once philosophers. There was a time in your life when you were always asking questions. Maybe you have a younger brother or sister or a child, 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 years old, and they're always asking why. It's quite annoying, but they're simply manifesting this innate love of wisdom, wanting to learn by asking questions. I remember when my son was quite young, we were driving through New Hampshire, and he looks out the car window, and he sees a cow, and he asked me, "What is that?" And I answered, "That's a cow." And I was quite proud of my fatherly, knowledge that that was a cow. But then he said, "Why? Why is that a cow?" And I must say I was at a loss for words. How do you explain why a cow is what it is, right? And so I just tried to distract him by saying, look at the birds. And that's what happens, right? As young children, we ask why questions, why? And before long, our parents or our teachers or those in authority, right, they get annoyed with our asking questions. And so we quite quickly learn to stop asking questions. It only gets us into trouble. So my job, in part, is to reawaken that child philosopher inside of you so that you can also begin to ask questions. So philosophers, and here's kind of the basic divisions of philosophy, and just so you know this, right? But metaphysics is that discipline in philosophy that asks questions about the nature of reality. Epistemology is that discipline in philosophy that asks questions about the nature of truth and knowledge. Then we have ethics, questions about good and bad, right and wrong. What makes a good person good, or what makes a bad person bad, or what makes an action right or an action wrong. Aesthetics, questions about art and beauty. And then logic, questions about good and bad arguments, things like validity, soundness, and fallacies. So those are kind of the major divisions within philosophy itself. So if someone asks you what is philosophy, you can simply say, well, philosophy is the love of wisdom, and that love is manifested by asking questions, right? Why things are the way they are, whether that's questions about reality, about truth and knowledge, about right and wrong, good and bad, about art and beauty, or about good and bad arguments, and so on. So let's go to our second question, right? Who is a philosopher? And really, I would say it's someone who asks those why questions in a commitment to 3 commitments, right? So it's a person committed to asking questions with these 3 commitments. And Socrates, for me, is the greatest example of a philosopher who asks those questions about life with 3 commitments. Number 1 is there's a commitment, I guess you see them all there, a commitment to intellectual honesty, right? That is to say, when a philosopher is asking questions, they're in pursuit of truth, right? With intellectual honesty. They have the humility to know that they don't know. But they're always open to asking new questions to themselves and others, right? Intellectual honesty is simply in the pursuit of truth, having the humility to admit that you don't know, but you want to know, Moral conscience is a commitment to goodness. In pursuit of goodness, a philosopher will not sacrifice people, right? In asking questions in the pursuit of wisdom and truth and knowledge, right? A philosopher makes sure that they always choose the ethical path to gaining that knowledge. They will not, right, demean or harass or in any way harm another human being in their pursuit of truth. So there's a balance between seeking truth and being kind and good towards others. And then finally, self-knowledge, right? A philosopher is someone who asks questions like Socrates in the pursuit of a beautiful life, right? The beautiful life of knowing themselves. Now, for Socrates, in a sense, the only knowledge that is crucial for life, capable of bringing us happiness, is self-knowledge, right? Philosophy is kind of divided between the pre-Socratic philosophers and the post-Socratic, because Socrates said that philosophy's main aim, right, should be based on gaining self-knowledge. The foundation of the good life, he said, was in self-knowledge. Only the person who can live well with him or herself will be able to live well with others, right? And that requires that self-knowledge. So with those questions answered, what is philosophy? Well, philosophy is a love of wisdom, a love that's manifested by asking questions. And who is a philosopher? A philosopher is that person who asks those questions, but in a commitment to truth, goodness, and beauty, or they pursue, right, wisdom with intellectual honesty, moral conscience, and self-knowledge. And this brings us then to my favorite philosopher of all time. Oops, yeah, I already said that. And that is Socrates. And my favorite philosophical work is The Apology, a book, a dialogue that's about the trial of Socrates. It's funny, my wife is not a big fan of Socrates. He probably wasn't the best of husbands. He was once asked by a student, he said, who asked Socrates, should I get married? And Socrates said, of course you should get married. And if you have a good marriage, you'll be happy. And if you have a bad marriage, you'll become a philosopher. I think that's why my wife doesn't really like Socrates. But luckily, I'm both happy and a philosopher, or I try to be a philosopher in any case. The apology, by the way, is a word that means defense, right? So this is the defense of Socrates. The dialogue takes place in 399 before the Common Era in Athens. Socrates, of course, is the star, though the author is Plato. Socrates did not write anything down, any of his teachings, sort of like Buddha and Jesus and Epictetus. All that we know of their teachings, we learn from those who wrote them down, but they never wrote them down themselves. Again, the scene here is the trial of Socrates. And we want to kind of get into the apology because it really illustrates for us what philosophy is and who a philosopher might be. But just remember that apology means defense, right? So it's Socrates' defense. And we'll get to that in just a moment. One other thing to mention, I think this is why Socrates is so relevant today. He lived between 470 and 399 before the Common Era in Athens. Athens was the original Western democracy, right? So it's kind of important. But Athens' democracy was in a deep crisis. Politics and their society seemed torn apart into two conflicting ideologies. You had the dogmatic absolutists and the dogmatic relativists, right? The dogmatic absolutists were the defenders of tradition, of past ways, right? The dogmatic absolutists were dogmatic in their insistence that they had the truth, that they were right, and if you didn't agree with them, you were wrong. They were the sole possessors of truth, goodness, and beauty, and you had to simply conform to their beliefs. We have the truth and you don't, kind of a thing. Now, in opposition to the dogmatic absolutists, you had the dogmatic relativists who were equally emphatic that there was no such thing as truth or wisdom. They were the new intellectual class, these dogmatic relatives. They were the sophists, right? They were advocates of a new way of thinking and living. For them, because they denied the existence of wisdom or truth, it was all about power. What mattered was political power and being able to manipulate others to think the way that you did. So because there was no truth, what was important was being persuasive enough to think people or to make people accept your ideas as true, even though they would laugh at you because they rejected the very notion of truth. Now, what the dogmatic absolutists and dogmatic relativists had in common was they both refused to question their own beliefs. They were both unwilling to listen to the other side, right? They both thought they were right and the others were wrong, and they shut down any questioning. So ideology trumped truth. Self-interest trumped facts. Staying in power was all that mattered, regardless of the consequences to society at large, right? And that's why I think Socrates in this dialogue is so relevant today. I mean, today we live in a very polarized time in the U.S., a time where facts and reality are whatever you want them to be. You know, whatever supports your ideology or beliefs is true. Everything else is false. So facts and truth must conform to your beliefs when it should be the other way around, right? Your beliefs should conform to facts and truth, but we live in a day where there's no humility, that those in power, the very highest office of our land, perpetuate daily conspiracies and falsehoods, right? Tweeting out things which are patently false, right? So I think we're living in a similar crisis today, where people don't believe the falsehoods which our political leaders foist upon us. But the point is not to make us believe lies, but to make us believe nothing. The point is to make us, right, confused enough that we throw up our hands and say, there must not be any right answer. It's whatever you want, right? It's into this crisis that Socrates comes, right? Socrates upsets both sides. Socrates is going to argue that we can neither be possessors of wisdom, nor can we be deniers of wisdom. But what we must all be is lovers of wisdom. For Socrates, there was truth, and we could know it. We just didn't know it yet. We had to pursue that knowledge by asking questions. So he upset the absolutists when he questioned them and found out that they didn't know what they were talking about. But he also upset the relativists because Socrates insisted there was truth out there that we could come to know. So he's a very important figure, and I think he's one that would very much benefit us today. So let's get into this dialogue. A couple of questions, right? What was Socrates charged with by the Athenians, and what event initiated his quest, his project of asking questions? So the charges against him, if you read the dialogue, were impiety and corrupting the youth, right? He was charged with turning the youth against their elders, if you will, corrupting them in that way, and for not believing in the gods of Athens, or not believing in the gods the way he should believe in the gods. On these two charges, and which philosophers have always been brought up on. Philosophers are always accused of atheism or impiety and corrupting the youth with their teachings. So he was perhaps the first, but definitely not the last. He was called before a jury of 500 citizens. So in the apology, if you can imagine this, he stands in front of 500 Athenians, his jury, who will decide whether or not he's guilty of impiety and corrupting the youth. Well, what got him into trouble, as he says in the dialogue, his occupation was a brickmaker. Brickmaker most of his life. He participated in the democracy of Athens. He fought in the Athenian wars. He actually had received medals for bravery. So he was pretty much a conscientious citizen. But then something happened. Something happened to throw him off the path of being just an ordinary, brickmaker. What happened is one of his friends, Chaerephon, went to the oracle at the at Delphi. Delphi is an island off the coast of Athens, and at Delphi there was a temple dedicated to the god Apollo. And in this temple was an oracle, a prophetess, who you could go and ask questions, and they would give you oracular responses. One of my favorite books when my kids were young was The Lightning Thief. Maybe some of you have read The Lightning Thief. In those books, if you've read them, you know that oracles can be kind of weird. In any case, Chaerephon asked the oracle, who is the wisest person in Athens? And the oracle's response was Socrates. Socrates is the wisest person in Athens. Now, Chaerephon, I think, was jubilant, very excited by this knowledge, right? And so he rushed to find Socrates, and he said, hey, Socrates, the prophetess, the oracle for the god Apollo, says you are the wisest man in Athens. Now, I imagine if you were told by someone that you were the wisest person, you might be kind of happy about that, right? But Socrates was perplexed. He didn't get it, right? Because he was the only one in Athens who did not claim to know anything, right? He was the only one in Athens who said he didn't know anything. So how could he be the wisest person? There were lots of people in Athens who claimed to possess wisdom. So Socrates decides that he has to go on a quest, right? In obedience, he thought, to this oracle of the god Apollo, to try to find out what that meant when the oracle said he was the wisest. So Socrates thought he would begin to ask Athenians questions to try to find someone wiser than himself. And he went to 3 classes of people. He went to the leadership class, the politicians, who claimed to have wisdom about how to lead a city, right, the polis. But what he discovered by asking them questions was they didn't really know what they were talking about. They claimed to have wisdom, but under examination, you found out they did not know what they thought they knew. He then went to the economic class, the business class, the artisans, who claimed to have wisdom about how to make, right, product and make money. But he found out again by asking them questions that they didn't really know what they thought they knew. He goes to the intellectual class, the artists, who also claim to possess wisdom, right? Knowledge about how to create beautiful works of art. But again, by his examining them, by him asking them questions, he discovers that they also are ignorant, but they don't know that they're ignorant, right? They think they know, but in fact, they don't. And of course, he upsets a lot of people, right? If you ask people questions and they claim to know the answer, but upon examination, it becomes obvious they don't know, well, they're going to get quite annoyed with you, quite upset. And so these citizens of Athens became quite upset with Socrates. And it was for that reason that they brought him up on these charges of corrupting the youth and impiety. So let's take a look at some of the wonderful things he says. So the first key theme here is the nature of wisdom. So what does Socrates believe it means to be wise, and what does it mean to be ignorant? Excuse me. Let's read a passage. I realize this is rather long, but he says, this investigation, right, of asking people questions he meets on the street has led to my having many enemies of the worst and most dangerous kind, and has given occasion also to many calumnies, which just means, slander. And I am called wise, for my hearers always imagine that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others, right? People thought he was just a wise arse, right? Asking questions that he knew the answers to, but nobody else did. But in fact, he always admitted his ignorance. He did not know, but he was trying to find out. But the truth is, O men of Athens, he says, that God only is wise. And in this oracle, he means to say that the wisdom of men is little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates. He's only using my name as an illustration, as if he said, he, O men, is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. I just think that's wonderful, right? God alone possesses wisdom. All that we humans can hope to be are lovers of wisdom, right? Pursuers of wisdom, not possessors nor deniers, right? Socrates goes on to say, and so I go on my way, obedient to the God, and make inquisition into the wisdom of anyone, whether citizen or stranger, who appears to be wise, and if he is not wise and in vindication of the oracle, I show him that he is not wise, and this occupation quite absorbs me, and I have no time to give either to any public matter of interest or to any concern of my own, but I am in utter poverty by reason of my devotion to the God, right? Love Socrates for that. Now, Socrates maybe was a bit naive, right? He thought that if someone claimed to know something, and then you were able to show them that they did not know what they thought they knew, that they would be grateful. Oh, thank you, Socrates. I thought I knew this, but now, of course, I see I do not. So thank you so much, because now I can learn the truth and give up the falsehood. But no, that's not what happened. When people found out, or when people were revealed to not know what they thought they did, instead of being grateful and humble, they became angry and vindictive, right? So to be wise for Socrates is to know that you don't know. To be ignorant is not to know, because we all are in that state of ignorance. To be ignorant is to think you know when in fact you don't. And if you think you know something that you don't, that kind of shuts off any learning, any growth, right? Because you stop asking questions. So the wise person is the person who's always asking questions. The ignorant person is a person who never asks a question and gets upset when other people ask questions. Well, let's go on to another. There you have that slide. To know that you know nothing, that is the meaning of true knowledge, right? Anyway, let's go to the next theme, importance of care for the soul. This is perhaps my favorite passage we're about to look at. The question to think about here are, according to Socrates, what did his fellow Athenians care most about? What did he think they should care most about? And what do you think, right? So if we look at this, this is my favorite. So I remember when I first read this when I was about your age, young college student, it just thrilled me. It changed my life. It changed the entire course of my life. Socrates got to me, I guess I should say. Let's just read this great passage. Someone will say, "Are you not ashamed, Socrates, of a course of life which is likely to bring you to an untimely end?" Now, I do kind of find that funny, because Socrates was about 70 years old when this takes place, which is quite old for not only today, but back then. But in any case, to him I may fairly answer, there you are mistaken. A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong, acting the part of a good man or of a bad. See, I like that. The sole criterion that should govern your actions is not, will this make me wealthy or poor? Is not, will this lead to a longer life or a shorter life, right? It's not to be worried about those things. The only criterion, the only concern is, are you doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Back to the quote, "If you say to me, Socrates, this time we will not mind Antaeus, one of his accusers, and will let you off, but upon one condition, that you are to inquire and speculate in this way. No more, right?" I think I misspoke that. "But if you are caught doing this again, you shall die." Now, I imagine that most of us, if someone came up to us and said, "Hey, stop going to school, stop doing whatever you're doing, and we'll let you live. But if you continue to do what you're doing, we're going to kill you," most of us would probably say, "Okay, I'll stop doing it." But not Socrates. He says, "If this was the condition on which you let me go, I should reply." And here, this is just a great, thrilling thing he says here. "Men of Athens, I honor and love you." I mean, I love that, because Socrates has no animosity, no hatred, no anger towards these men of Athens who hate him. "But I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner, and convincing him, saying, 'O my friend, why do you, who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, or Orem, or Provo, or Spanish Fork, or Salt Lake City, or wherever it is, why do you care so much about laying up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Are you not ashamed of this?'" Isn't that fantastic, right? See, he knew that most people, right, they're ambitious, they aspire to wealth and popularity and fame and status and power. And in that pursuit of those things, they neglect caring for their character, caring for virtue and goodness in themselves, right? And he was trying to turn the tables on the men of Athens, right? Indicting them, if you will, charging them with neglect of that which is most important in their life. He goes on to say, "For I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons and your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. I tell you that virtue is not given by money, but that from virtue come money and every other good of man, public as well as private. This is my teaching. And if this is the doctrine which corrupts the youth, my influence is ruinous indeed," right? Again, I just so inspired by this. Socrates knew that our human tendency was to pursue money and status and reputation, often at the expense of goodness and knowledge, right, and character. He wanted to remedy this. He wanted to remind the Athenians. He wants to remind us today, right, to not sacrifice the most important for the least important. Again, most people think that having a lot of money will make them happy, and not having a lot of money will make them dissatisfied and unhappy. Yet the greatest thinkers, the most noble persons that represent humanity, whether it's Buddha or Jesus or Socrates or Gandhi, have all made it quite clear that this is a false belief. This belief itself, that only money can make us happy or is required for happiness, makes us unhappy. It leads to the next thing we have to talk about here, which is the next topic of the examined life. But just for a moment, right, we need to think about what it is that we think will bring us happiness. There's a distinction that philosophers like to make between external values or goods and internal values or goods, right? Now, the important thing to note are these two columns are both goods: wealth, money, reputation, position, title. Those are good things. I wish I had more money. I wouldn't mind having more money. I want to have a good reputation. I want to have a nice position here at the university and titles. Those are good things. There's nothing wrong, nothing evil about wanting or enjoying money, reputation, positions, and titles, right? On the other hand, you have wisdom, character, strengths, and truth. Those are also good things. So they're all good things, but there is an important distinction in the name itself, right? Internal versus external. Because wealth and money, reputation, positions, and titles, even though they're good things, they're not entirely in your control. Other people give you money, right? Your wealth comes from outside of yourself. Your reputation is given to you by others. Positions and titles as well are things which come from outside of you. Others give them to you, and others can also take them away from you. So the problem with prioritizing wealth and reputation, positions and titles as your pathway to happiness, it's not that it's evil, it's just ignorant, right? It's lacking the self-knowledge. It would tell you that those things, because they're not in your control, cannot be the efficient, effective, best way to happiness. On the other hand, wisdom, character, strengths, and truth are things entirely in your control. No one can stop you from gaining wisdom, character, strength, or truth. And no one can take it away from you once you have it. So Socrates is not saying the Athenians are evil for their prioritizing external goods over internal goods. He's simply saying that's a pathway to great unhappiness for themselves and others, right? That we should prioritize in our life wisdom, character, strength, and truth. That's this practice of graceful presence, right? To aspire to the greatness of goodness. He wants us to be ambitious in life. Socrates wants us to be ambitious, to aspire to great things. But the things that we should aspire to are the greatness of these internal goods, right? Too often we aspire to the greatness of external goods, and that only creates conflict, dissatisfaction, and eventual unhappiness. So Socrates is simply trying to reorient our aspirations and our ambitions towards the internal goods, right? Wisdom, character, strength, and truth. And again, this brings us to one of the last slides here. According to Socrates, what type of life is not worth living? It's kind of a rough thing, but a very popular statement that he makes, we get to here. He said, someone will say, yes, Socrates, but cannot you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city, and no one will interfere with you. Now, I have great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this. For if I tell you that this would be a disobedience to a divine command, and therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I am serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, and that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, that you are still less likely to believe, right? So, interesting statement, but that's a famous statement, that the unexamined life is not worth living. It goes back to what I said at the start, right? For Socrates, the most crucial knowledge to have is self-knowledge. Self-knowledge gained through self-examination. Because only with self-knowledge can you have the right aspirations. Only with self-knowledge, right, can you live well with yourself and live well with others. It's kind of the foundational knowledge that we have to have. And this self-knowledge only comes about from the examined life, right? You realize through this examined life that it's not money, but character. The person you become, that is key to happiness, right? So if you're the kind of person who thinks that you need money to be happy, you'll never truly be happy, right? If you make yourself into that type of person who can be happy and content with or without money or wealth, then you'll possess genuine and lasting happiness, right? Based on the internal goods of character, knowledge, and truth. Well, Socrates gives his defense, and you kind of saw it here, defense against impiety. He says, in fact, that his life was lived in obedience to the God, and he was not going to be disobedient, even if that meant to save his life. He also argued that if corrupting the youth means you try to teach them to have right priorities in life, then, of course, maybe he corrupted the youth. But I don't know about you. I think I would have found him innocent of the two charges. But he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. And a very famous death scene. I think I assigned you to watch the documentary on Socrates, and you'll see that death scene at the very end. But I want to kind of end this by looking at kind of his goodbye, right? So he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to die. And he says at the very end of the apology, kind of his going away, he says, wherefore, O judges, be of good cheer about death, and know this of a truth, that no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. Still I have a favor to ask of them. When my sons are grown up, I would ask you, O my friends. Now that touches me, right? I mean, here are these 500 Athenians have sentenced him to death, and yet he calls them my friends. I ask you, O my friends, to punish them, and I would have you trouble them as I have troubled you. If they seem to care about riches or anything more than about virtue, or if they pretend to be something when they are really nothing, then reprove them as I have reproved you, for not caring about that for which they ought to care, and thinking that they are something when they are really nothing. And if you do this, I and my sons will have received justice at your hands. And then the very famous last line, the hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better, God only knows. What a wonderful philosopher, a great life, this Socrates. Again, the main message I want us to get out of his apology is this invitation, this suggestion that we should be ambitious in life. We should aspire to greatness. But the greatness we should aspire to should be that of goodness, right? Not status. So to kind of wrap this up, we've looked at 5 practices now for graceful presence. The first practice comes from Buddha. It's to accept what you're feeling, not to react to your emotions, your moods, right? Don't throw those second darts, but breathe into your emotions. The second practice, to care for your body through sleep, diet, exercise, right? We'll talk more about that as we go along here. The third practice from Marcus Aurelius, right? Direct your inner voice to speak the language of love, compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. Epictetus, right? Focus on what you can control and accept what you cannot. Practice objectivity of perception and attunement of inner attitude. And then finally, today with Socrates, right? Aspire to the greatness of goodness. Be ambitious in your life, but be ambitious for truth, goodness, and beauty, right? Live the life of a philosopher. live a life out of a commitment to intellectual honesty, moral conscience, and self-knowledge. You can do it. I believe in you. So start today. The quiz code for those of you taking the quiz is 1212. Thank you very much.